Welcome to my channel. Please support my channel with subscribe, like, and share. Thank you. The night it all began didn't look special. It was just another Friday evening in Seattle, with the rain whispering softly against the windows of the little cafe by the harbor. But for Alina, 26, a painter who'd lost her spark, and Daniel, 57, a writer who'd forgotten how to dream, that night would change everything. Alina sat alone at a corner table, sketchbook open, half-finished cup of coffee beside her. She had that faraway look people get when they're trying not to cry in public. Her latest art gallery had been cancelled, her landlord had raised the rent, and her poor heart felt tired. Across the cafe, Daniel watched her. He wasn't staring out of rudeness, he was studying her the way a writer studies the world, trying to understand a story before it's even told. His salt and pepper hair framed a kind face, and his dark blue sweater somehow matched the mood of the rain. When the barista called, "Last call for wine," Daniel glanced up and saw Alina lift her hand slightly, hesitating, as if she couldn't decide whether to stay or leave. Something inside him stirred a quiet pull. He stood, walked to the counter, and said softly, "Make it to glasses. I'll take one to the artist in the corner." Alina looked up, startled, as Daniel approached with a small, confident smile. "You looked like you could use a toast," he said. She blinked, then smiled faintly. "To what, exactly?" He shrugged. "To not giving up on something beautiful even when it's hard to believe it's still worth it." That line made her laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it felt like he understood something no one else had noticed. They clinked glasses, and for a moment, the world outside vanished. Rain softened into rhythm, and the cafe's amber lights painted warmth over everything. Daniel spoke with a quiet intelligence that made Alina forget the noise in her head. She told him about her art, her dreams, and how lately she couldn't find meaning in anything she painted. He listened, really listened. Then he said, "You're too close to your own storm. Sometimes you need distance to see what the clouds were trying to teach you." Something in his voice made her heart shift. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was deep. It felt like the universe had sent her a stranger who spoke the same unspoken language of the soul. When the cafe finally closed, neither of them wanted to leave. They stood under the same umbrella outside, waiting for the rain to ease. It didn't. Instead, it poured harder, and both of them started laughing, standing too close for two people who had just met. "Where's your car?" he asked. "I walked," she said. "It's only a few blocks." "I'll walk you," he offered, his tone more protective than bold. They strolled down the glistening street, shoes splashing through shallow puddles. Streetlights shimmered against wet asphalt, and the world around them felt softer, quieter, like something was unfolding that shouldn't be rushed. Halfway to her building, Alina stopped under a "Why did you really talk to me?" she asked. Daniel took a slow breath, meeting her gaze. "Because I saw someone who reminded me of myself years ago. Someone trying to find meaning in a world that moves too fast." She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "You make it sound like you already found yours." His smile was gentle but sad. "Maybe I did. Maybe I lost it again." They stood there for a long time, the rain slowing to a soft drizzle. Alina felt warmth where her heart had been cold for months. There was something magnetic in his calm presence, something she couldn't name. When they finally reached her apartment building, she turned toward him, hesitant. "Would you like to come in? Just for a glass of real wine. I mean, the cafe's kind dose in tea count." Daniel chuckled. "I'd like that." Her apartment was small, filled with unfinished canvases, and the scent of turpentine. She poured red wine into 2 glasses, her fingers trembling slightly. He noticed but said nothing, only smiling softly. They sat by the window, the city lights reflecting off the glass. The air between them hummed with unspoken energy. "I feel like I've known you longer than an hour," she admitted. "Sometimes," he said, "you meet someone, and time bends around it." It was quiet for a moment, too quiet. Then she asked, "How old are you, Daniel?" He smiled faintly. 57. Her eyebrows rose, but there was no judgment, only curiosity. "You don't look it, and you," he asked. 26. He nodded slowly. "You're the age I was when I thought I knew everything." They both laughed softly, and for a brief second, their eyes met in a way that made both of them forget the numbers between them. It wasn't about age, it was about connection. Then, without thinking, Alina brushed her hand across his as she reached for the wine bottle. The touch was brief, accidental but electric. Her breath caught, and his hand froze in place, fingers still warm against hers. Neither spoke. The silence said everything. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, soft like the echo of something inevitable. Alina drew in a shaky breath and whispered, I don't know what this is, Daniel, but it feels different. He looked at her, eyes steady and kind. Then maybe it's worth finding out. The rain began again, harder this time, running down the window like liquid glass. Inside that small apartment, the two sat strangers no longer, hearts opening in quiet confusion and awe. As midnight approached, neither moved to end the night. The air was thick with possibility, and just when it felt like the night might fade into ordinary silence, Daniel said something that would echo in her mind for weeks to come. Sometimes the universe doesn't give us people to state it, gives us people to awaken us. Alina didn't know it yet, but that sentence would change the course of her life. The next morning, Seattle woke beneath a pale gray sky. The rain had quieted, but inside Elena's apartment, the echo of last night still lingered, soft laughter, shared silence, and that one electric touch that neither of them dared to name. Daniel had left before dawn, leaving behind his scarf on the chair and a note scribbled in his careful handwriting. Thank you for reminding me that the world can still surprise us. Alina read it 3 times, tracing the curve of each letter. She felt something in her chest shift, not love, not yet, but a stirring she hadn't felt in years. That entire day, she painted, not for the gallery, not for anyone, just for herself. For the first time in months, the colors flowed. Her brush danced. Every stroke carried the warmth of that rainy night, the way Daniel had looked at her like she was a story. He wanted to understand. 3 days passed before she saw him again. It happened by accident. At the same harbor cafe where they first met, he was sitting by the window with a notebook open, the light falling across his face like a quiet secret. When he looked up and saw her, his eyes softened, as though he'd been expecting her all along. Alina, he said, standing, you look different. She smiled shyly. I started painting again. That's good, he replied, his voice warm. See what happens when you talk to strange old men in coffee shops. She laughed, shaking her head. You don't seem old, Daniel, you just seem unfinished. That made him pause and smile in that slow, thoughtful way of his. Maybe that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. They spent hours talking that afternoon. Not about art or writing this time, but about life, about the pieces they'd lost and the quiet ache of growing older or growing apart. Daniel told her about his divorce. 12 years ago, how he'd tried to fill the silence with books, travel, and words that never quite healed what was broken. Alina told him about leaving Chicago after her mother's death, how Seattle had seemed like a place where she could start over, until she realized she'd brought her loneliness with her. By the time the sky turned gold, the cafe was nearly empty. The waiter had stopped glancing at their table. The world outside was fading into dusk. You ever feel like you're standing in the middle of your own life? Alina said softly, and somehow, it's not really yours anymore. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Every day, until recently, her breath caught at that. He didn't say her name again, but he didn't need to. It hung there between them, a quiet confession. When they finally left, he walked her to her car. The harbor glimmered under the fading light, and gulls cried overhead. Neither wanted the evening to end. Daniel, she said, stopping beside her car. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why me? I mean, you could talk to anyone. Why did you choose to talk to me that night? He hesitated, then said softly, because you looked like you'd forgotten how extraordinary you are, and I think part of me needed to remind someone else, just to remember it myself. Alina swallowed, her heart fluttering with something that felt both frightening and tender. That sounds dangerous. He smiled faintly. Maybe. But the best things usually are. That night, back in her apartment, she couldn't sleep. Daniel's words kept circling in her mind like waves against a shore. She went to her easel and began painting again, this time a portrait. His eyes, his calm, the quiet sadness beneath his smile. By dawn, the canvas was alive, and in the middle of that quiet morning, her phone buzzed with a message. Daniel, I can't stop thinking about that conversation. About you. Alina stared at the screen, her heart racing. She didn't reply right away, just sat there, staring at the painting. Realizing that something was happening she couldn't explain, something neither age nor reason could undo. That the next evening, he invited her to his place, an old house on the hill, overlooking the Sound. Just dinner, he said, and maybe some real wine this time. As she stood outside his door, her hand hovering over the bell, she took a deep breath. Everything inside her felt alive, afraid, hopeful, uncertain. When he opened the door, he wasn't the quiet writer from the cafe anymore. He was a man whose eyes said everything he'd been holding back. Alina, he said softly, almost in disbelief. You came. She smiled, voice trembling. I had too. And as she stepped inside, the air between them changed again, deep, electric, and full of the kind of emotion that could either save them or break them completely. The house on the hill was warm with the scent of roasted herbs and old books. Daniel had lit candles, not for drama, but for peace. The kind of peace that soft light gives to two people who aren't sure what they're about to feel. Alina stood by the window while he poured the wine. From there she could see the harbor lights twinkling far below, the same ones that had framed their first conversation. She turned and smiled. You cook? Daniel chuckled. I try. It keeps me from writing too many sad endings. She laughed, easing into the comfort of his voice. The way he moved, the calm in his presence, it felt different from the fast, restless energy of people her age. He didn't rush to fill silence. He let it breathe, and somehow that made her feel seen. Dinner was simple: grilled salmon, fresh bread, and wine from a vineyard he'd visited years ago. They ate slowly, talking about everything and nothing. The smell of rain, the loneliness of airports, the strange joy of finding someone who listens. At one point she said, "You make it sound like the world still has meaning." He looked up. It always does. We just forget to look. Something about that made her eyes sting. She'd spent so long doubting herself, chasing approval, feeling small in a city that never stopped moving. But here with him she felt steady again. After dinner, they moved to the living room. A small fire crackled in the hearth, the sound soft and rhythmic. She noticed his old typewriter on a desk near the window. Do you still write with that? Sometimes, he said, smiling, when I want to remember how words used to feel before everything went digital. Alina walked over and pressed a single key. It clicked, a sharp, honest sound that echoed in the quiet room. It's beautiful, she whispered. He watched her from the armchair, the firelight brushing her hair with gold. You are, too, he said before he could stop himself. She turned. For a moment, neither spoke. The compliment wasn't heavy, it was tender, real. She sat across from him, curling her legs beneath her. You know, she said softly, I used to think connection was supposed to feel loud, like fireworks. But this feels different. Daniel nodded. That's because it's real. They fell into a silence so deep it didn't need filling. The fire popped. The rain returned lightly against the windows. And in that small space between them, something unspoken grew stronger. When she finally spoke again, her voice trembled slightly. You make me feel like I'm allowed to start over. He leaned forward, resting his hands together. Alina, you don't need my permission, but if you ever forget how to believe again, I'll remind you. Her heart tightened. She didn't know whether to thank him or to cry. Instead, she smiled and said, Then don't disappear. I won't, he promised. Later, as she stood at the door, ready to leave, he handed her his scarf, the same one he'd forgotten at her place days ago. You can keep it, he said, for luck. She looked down at it, then back at him. Or maybe it's a reason to see you again. He laughed quietly. I was hoping you'd say that. The rain had stopped, and the sky outside was painted with silver clouds. They stood there for a moment, too close, too aware. Then she stepped forward and hugged him a long, sincere embrace that said everything words couldn't. It wasn't desire that filled the space. It was understanding. The kind that comes when two people recognize something fragile but real. When she finally pulled back, she said softly, You make me feel calm. That's rare for me. He smiled, brushing her shoulder gently. Then keep that feeling. It's yours. As she drove home, the scarf resting on the seat beside her, she couldn't stop smiling. The night hadn't ended in passion or grand declarations, but in something deeper. Trust, warmth, the beginning of something she didn't quite have a name for yet. She rolled down the window slightly, letting the cold air hit her face. It felt like freedom, and somewhere inside that quiet joy, she knew her life had just begun to change. The weeks that followed became a quiet rhythm between them. Messages that started with good morning and ended with sleep well. Sometimes they met for coffee, other times for long walks along the waterfront, where the sea air seemed to ease the unspoken things between them. Alina had started painting again. Really painting with color and life she hadn't touched in years. Her friends noticed the change, the light in her eyes, the way she smiled more easily now. But when they asked what had happened, she just said, Someone reminded me how to breathe. Daniel never tried to take up more space in her life than she gave him. That was what she liked most about him. He didn't rush her. He didn't demand answers. He simply showed up with patience, with warmth, and with the kind of quiet strength that made her feel safe. One Saturday, he invited her to an old bookstore tucked away in Pike Place Market. It was the kind of place that smelled like time, aged paper, and wood. Every story you could ever need, he said as he handed her a cup of tea from the shop's tiny cafe corner. She smiled. You really believe books can fix people? He shook his head. Not fix them? Just remind them they're not alone. Something about that made her heart ache in the best way. She thought about all the nights she'd spent staring at blank canvases, feeling invisible. Now, standing there among stories, she didn't feel invisible anymore. That evening, they drove to a quiet lookout above the city. The sun was setting, painting the skyline in orange and rose gold. Alina leaned against the railing, the wind teasing her hair. You ever wish you could freeze a moment? She asked. Daniel looked at her and smiled. Only when I'm in one worth remembering. Their eyes met, and something inside her softened completely. The age difference, the doubts, the noise of the world. None of it mattered. What they shared wasn't a story of rebellion or drama. It was one of calm discovery. Two people finding something pure at an unexpected time. She said softly, You make me feel like I'm allowed to be more than my mistakes. And you, he replied, make me feel like I still have time. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, full of the small, invisible connection that had been growing stronger with every passing day. Later, back at her studio, she showed him one of her new paintings. It was abstract shades of blue and gold blending like waves and light. He stood quietly, studying it. It's beautiful, he said. She looked at him, her voice quiet. It's you, or at least, what meeting you feels like. Daniel blinked, touched. I don't know what to say. You don't have to, she replied. Just stay in the picture. He smiled, that soft, knowing smile that had drawn her in from the beginning. That night, as he walked her home, rain began to fall again. Gentle and rhythmic like a familiar song. They didn't run for cover this time. They walked slowly, side by side, letting the rain wash over them. When they reached her door, Elena turned to him. I don't know where this is going, Daniel, but I know it feels right. He nodded. Then that's enough for now. She reached up, brushed a raindrop from his cheek, and whispered, Thank you for finding me. He took her hand, squeezed it gently, and said, Maybe we found each other. And for the first time in years, both of them felt something rare, peace, wrapped in possibility. That night, Alina sat by her window with his scarf draped over her shoulders. Below, the city lights flickered like quiet promises. She didn't need to name what they were becoming. Sometimes, the heart simply knows. Winter came softly to Seattle that year. The mornings grew misty, and the harbor's water turned to silver. But inside Elena's small studio, life was color again. Bright, fearless, alive. Her art began to bloom beyond her walls. A local gallery reached out, asking to feature her new collection, pieces filled with light and emotion. She titled the show, Second Chances. Daniel was there for every step, helping her hang the canvases, carrying frames, writing the short artist's note for the entrance wall. He never took credit, never stood in the spotlight. He was just there, steady, kind, quietly proud. On opening night, the gallery buzzed with people. Soft jazz played, and the air smelled of paint and champagne. Alina stood near the entrance, watching the crowd move from one painting to another. Every piece told a story of rediscovery, of rain, of patience, of the fragile power of connection. When Daniel arrived, dressed in his usual calm blue, the room seemed to soften. Their eyes met across the space, and for a moment, she forgot about everyone else. He smiled. You did it. She smiled back. We did it. Later, when the crowd had thinned, she led him to one particular painting, the centerpiece. It was called The Night of the Rain. Swirls of soft gray and gold showed two blurred silhouettes standing under an umbrella, surrounded by a world that seemed to dissolve around them. Daniel stared at it for a long time, his throat tight. That's us, he said quietly. She nodded. It's not a love story the world will understand, but it's ours. He turned toward her, eyes gentle but full. Alina, I never expected this. At my age, you think the best chapters are already written. She smiled through tears. Maybe we're just writing the quiet ones now, the kind people feel instead of read. They stood in silence for a long moment, just looking at each other. The years between them, the doubts, the fear, none of it mattered. What mattered was the calm truth that love doesn't always arrive on time. Sometimes, it just arrives when your heart is finally ready. A few months later, on another rainy evening, Daniel surprised her with something small but beautiful, a new set of brushes, wrapped in brown paper. For the next chapter, he said. She held his hand, smiling. Only if you're in it. He laughed softly. I'm not going anywhere. Then, after a pause, he added, but one day, when you've painted everything you've ever dreamed of, promise me you'll keep a little space for the night that started it all. Alina nodded, tears glimmering in her eyes. I will. Years passed quietly. Her art grew, her name became known. Daniel kept writing short essays, small reflections often about the beauty of timing, the poetry of late beginnings. And though time moved forward, the memory of that first rainy night never faded. It lived in her paintings, in his words, in the way they looked at each other, not with possession, but with deep gratitude, because sometimes, love isn't about forever, it's about being found when you most needed to be seen. One evening, standing again by the harbor cafe where it all began, Alina smiled at the sea and whispered softly to herself, some stories aren't meant to burn bright, they're meant to glow quietly, like candlelight that never goes out. And somewhere inside that thought, she could still hear his voice calm, steady, alive, saying, you reminded me that it's never too late to feel again. The end.